Hello, everyone. This is a presentation that I put together and presented for the Northwest Horticultural Society and their annual symposium that took place last year. And it's a talk I call Finding Common Ground, Getting to Know the Northwest Asian Gardening Community. So this symposium actually was an honor to be a part of. It was put together with a panel of a very diverse group of people from different backgrounds, talking about horticulture, but also talking about the people in horticulture and the lack of diversity and people of color within the field. So I was a late addition to the lineup actually after a speaker had dropped out, and I was kind of put in a situation where, okay, well, what am I going to talk about? I had to come up with a topic that obviously resonated with what was going on with society. Then, of course, Black Lives Matter was in the news, and it really forced many of us to think about our own biases, our own prejudices, and how we look at race and the people around us. And speaking to a horticultural society, I thought and reflected on the fact that there are very few people of color, whether they're hobbyists or professionals, how very few people of color are actually represented in horticulture. So I took this opportunity to put together a talk to do a little bit of research and a little bit of soul searching in a way to understand a little bit more about my own background, my own history as an Asian American here in the Pacific Northwest. And it's been an interesting process and journey to present to you today. And the meat of this presentation is a conversation that I would like to have and would like to continue to have with everyone to showcase the different voices in this community. There are times where I feel like I'm the only person of color, I'm the only Asian individual that is an avid gardener in the Pacific Northwest, and that's simply not true. I've been very fortunate and very privileged to have an opportunity to have a platform in which I can showcase my work. But at the same time, work in horticulture and plants aside, I feel like I need to represent and use the platform to share other voices and share these wonderful stories that we don't get to hear. So without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. So this talk is about exploring an Asian perspective, and I'm going to go through a very brief history of Asian Americans in the Pacific Northwest. So this is basically going to touch on a very general theme that I want you all, after this presentation, to take with you. So I'm not going to inundate you with too many dates and too many facts, but just the bits and pieces that I would like for you to take through this presentation. And it actually helps us realize where we are, where we were then, where things were, and where we are now. But the meat of this presentation, as I mentioned, is going to be in the gardeners and the people that I want to introduce to you today. And with that, a Q&A with these gardeners and asking them really difficult questions that I've been thinking about for myself and how I feel in terms of being a member in the gardening community here in the Pacific Northwest. So history of Asian Americans really goes way back, and it began with the Chinese in the 1860s that either moved here directly from China or came up here from California as miners, those that worked in the railroad. So the Chinese were the very first of the Asian Americans to come to the Pacific Northwest to live and work here, followed by the Japanese and the Filipinos, who worked in lumber and other fields, and also as farmers in the local farms here. And then later on, other Pacific Island countries and other Asian nations have come in and created this very rich tapestry of Asian Americans and the communities within them. To me, this image sort of sums up the history of Asian Americans as potential gardeners. Obviously, this is not a home. There are no beautiful flowers or interesting trees and shrubs and rare and exotic plants, but merely spinach or strawberries or corn, whatever the crop may be. But this is my history. This is where my great grandparents might have been might have been working. So this is the image that really comes to mind, that it was really about work. It wasn't about having a beautiful garden to go home to relax after a day's work. It wasn't the beautiful flowers to grow for a blue ribbon at the county fair or any of that sort. It was hard, backbreaking labor to earn money to provide for their families here in the Northwest, but also very typical that they would earn money and send it back home. So it's a very common story there. But one thing I realized that I discovered during this research about my past and Asian Americans and how they became to be gardeners here in the Northwest was the competition and the competitiveness that took place when many other cultures, many other people of color began to move and migrate to the Pacific Northwest seeking work opportunities. So even within the Asian community, amongst the Filipinos, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, etc., job opportunities were plentiful but became very scarce. Sometimes uh, it was difficult to find work. And in doing so, it's created this tension and this competition between them and even other minorities as well, the Hispanics that have moved up north, and in the Black community moving in as well, trying to pursue those same positions became very competitive. And then this sort of competition began to surface between them as if they were kind of being pitted up against. And it didn't make sense to me now, but in reading this and looking back to what my parents and what my grandparents would say about other Asians and other races, finally began to make sense. Why I would hear comments like, "Oh, you shouldn't go to downtown because there are, Black people there. They are this and that." And then, "Oh, the Vietnamese, they are this, and they're always doing that," and like mostly negative things that, to me as a child, I would sort of scratch my head thinking, that doesn't seem right. Um, I had other Asian classmates, and in some ways, I feel like I could relate to them. We both kind of had the same struggles. A lot of us were in ESL together. We liked a lot of the same foods and liked a lot of the same shows, and we had very similar interests. But it wasn't until reading about this competition and this tension between the different minorities back in the day where that perception that my grandparents and that my parents had was what they saw and what they communicated to us as their children. So it's something to really keep in mind as we go through this talk, and it's something that I have to reflect on and think about as I move ahead and I think about my interactions with other Asians and other people of color. With this cultural influence that came about with these communities coming together here in the Pacific Northwest, especially within the Asian community, there was a very strong desire to preserve a lot of their culture, a lot of their traditions that they would bring back from their homeland here to the United States. So things like different customs, different types of food, and a lot of that also came their different hobbies, whether it be art or gardening and that sort of thing. And with that, the general population began to take notice, obviously, and Eastern art and their cultural ways and became really popular over time, whether it was Chinese food or Taekwondo or martial arts, that sort of thing began to develop within these communities. And as these communities grew, businesses began to open up. They were working so hard, saving enough money so they themselves can fulfill that American dream of opportunity. So with new businesses came money and families and children, but then with them having educational opportunities as well. So that brings us to this often difficult topic to discuss, but I think really important to talk about, especially at this time where racism and discrimination are very prevalent. And so let's talk about the Asian stereotypes. And the biggest one is probably the model minority myth. So in finding the definition for the model minority and what this is all about, the one example I can think of that I can share with you is the perception that all Asians are good at math. That's the one thing that really stands out. I mean, there's so many other things that people will assume that just because you're Asian, you are this. And I use that example because I was terrible at math. I mean, I did okay, I got through, but it didn't come easy to me like what most people would assume. But one of the biggest stereotypes and part of this model minority myth is being considered this obedient race, being those that were always following the rules, always staying silent and quiet, and you were never to speak back or talk back to any others. And to me, this was instilled early on when we first moved here to the United States. So I was always told by my parents to um, do as they're told, as they meaning white people, being told that that whatever they did was correct and was superior, that I was not allowed to talk back to them, that they were always right, and to get anywhere, get a raise, to get a job, to reach a certain goal or level, you had to work that much harder to gain any sort of attention, gain any sort of respect within this field. So you always had to do as you were told. So that basically became that mantra. And to this day, I still feel like I am this obedient Asian man that doesn't always speak up, that is not assertive at all. And as we all know, that's simply not true. But within those stereotypes, though, there are a lot of things that were positive, I think, that Asians were known for. And it's one of those things that a lot of us take great pride in. But amidst all that, one of the stereotypes, I guess, could be said in terms of our art and our aesthetic and our way of thinking and looking at life, this is where we can begin to introduce this concept of gardens and the creation of gardens. So within the Puget Sound region, there are 3 gardens that I want to introduce you to that we have here in Seattle that showcase this aesthetic. And here in these 3 gardens, you can see that they are basically of Japanese and Chinese influence, simply because of climate. We have climates very similar to Japan and parts of China, and the plant palette that we're able to grow. We have a lot of plants native to Japan and China that grow and thrive here in the Pacific Northwest. Now, there could possibly be a Filipino or Vietnamese or Cambodian garden, but being in warm tropical regions, that's a little hard to to achieve here in the Pacific Northwest. But hey, where who says it can't be done? I think there's some potential there. But I want to start by talking about these 3 gardens and the roles that they played in influencing the landscape here in the Northwest. The Seattle Japanese Garden. So the idea for a Japanese garden here in Seattle really began in the early 1900s during the Alaska and Yukon Exposition, when they had a display of a pavilion and a very serene garden. So it was peaceful, it was very tranquil. And because of the plant palette and the similarities in plant palette and what we can grow here, in the late 1950s, the idea and a design for a Japanese garden here in Seattle really began to take shape and to take form. So this type of image is what people begin to see now and what we'll associate with the Japanese garden. This serene, tranquil, beautiful landscape that was simple, but very deliberate in its execution. The maintenance and the upkeep was very high, but this sort of encapsulated what the lifestyle the people wanted, basically. A place to relax and to meditate and to reflect. So this image of the Japanese garden really attracted a lot of people to basically apply a lot of their design principles into their own yards, into their own gardens, by having Japanese maples and pines, the so-called staples within the landscape that we see all the time. And even in the architecture here too, where spaces here began to merge from the inside of the home into the outside, and the blending of the two and the transitions between the two in a garden. People and designers, I should say, began to pay more attention to that. So the Japanese influence is very, very strong. And here's an example of the Japanese garden here in Seattle during fall, where you can see this collaboration coming together of the Japanese aesthetic and style and upkeep and maintenance, combined with this backdrop of the Pacific Northwest. So in the background here, you see our native Douglas firs and Western red cedars that set off this beautiful, ornate landscape filled with fall color of plants native to Asia that thrive here in the Pacific Northwest. The Japanese maples, for example, that beautiful ginkgo in full color up against the backdrop of our broadleaf coniferous trees. And of course, Asia has its own conifers as well, beautifully grown and pruned and manicured to achieve this beautiful tranquil landscape. Now, the Seattle Chinese Garden is in its early phases, and most of you are probably wondering, oh, does Seattle have a Chinese garden? In fact, they do. And because it's still so new, not everyone is familiar with it or has probably even been there, but it does exist, and people are able to visit. If you're ever in West Seattle, it's on the north side of the South Seattle College campus. And this is a garden that is slowly evolving over time. They have a very grand master plan in place. And of course, like with any organization, any garden, really, funding is the main key. So once they raise those funds, they'll slowly evolve and put this master plan and bring it to life. But what's currently there is still pretty remarkable. And if you look at this photograph here, minus the beautiful peonies in the foreground, is the Songmei Pavilion. And in the very backdrop there is the Seattle city skyline. So a beautiful view from West Seattle in this new but really exciting garden. And currently, the main feature of this Chinese garden is the Knowing the Spring courtyard that was built just a few years ago. And this provides an opportunity for the Seattle community, the Seattle Chinese community, to gather and to celebrate and have events. Of course, without a pandemic, but it's still accessible. But before the pandemic, we saw events here taking place, whether it was Tai Chi demonstrations, lion dances during the Lunar New Year, and also the Peony Festival that takes place, really brings this community of people together, particularly the Chinese community, to feel at home, to be able to celebrate their culture and their traditions and their festivities as well. So I'm very excited to see where the Chinese garden goes. And the last garden I want to talk to you about is KUBOTA Garden. And this is in South Seattle. And not until a few years ago, KUBOTA Garden was always this sort of hidden gem within Seattle's landscapes and city parks. So not until just a few years ago that because of social media, it became this sort of Instagram, viral sort of garden, that people are beginning to discover because it's so unique and so special. Compared to the Seattle Japanese Garden, which was designed and executed using the principles of Japanese garden design, Kubota has an interesting twist to it, I guess, is a way to put it. Mr. Fujitaro Kubota was a landscaper and had his landscaping business. And in a way, Kubota Garden was his nursery where he would keep his plants. And actually, if you walk through the gardens, you can see plantings of rows of the same plants that were probably a field row during his nursery that just sort of kind of grew in its place. And it's when you visit the garden, it has a Japanese feel to it. It has different elements that you would recognize, but at the same time, it also has a very diverse plant palette and spaces to walk through where it's a wonderful sort of strolling garden is the way I would describe it, where it's an opportunity to escape the hustle and bustle of the city to just be immersed in nature in a way. So Mr. Kubota is also responsible for the design of the Japanese garden, another Japanese garden that's in the Bloedel Reserve. And if you're not familiar with the Bloedel Reserve, it's actually one of my favorite landscapes. It's in Bainbridge Island here in Washington in Puget Sound. And I have a beautiful image to show you to showcase his work. Now in this photo, you can see very familiar elements, water, the bridge. The plant palette there is a little bit more diverse, hodgepodge sometimes some people might say, but it's an interesting space to just wander and walk through. And here is Mr. Kubota's beautiful work at the Bloedel Reserve. Tranquil, peaceful, and one of my favorite landscapes, as I said. So given that introduction of a little bit of history of the Asian Americans and Asian American potential Asian American gardeners, I guess you could say, and examples of Asian influenced gardens here in the Puget Sound region, I want to take this time to introduce to you a few friends and colleagues and the Asian gardeners of the Northwest today. So during this pandemic, it's been really interesting, to say the least, to try and meet and connect with others. So I had to be very careful about making sure I wear my mask, I'm keeping social distance, and making sure my friends were comfortable in meeting and having a conversation. A lot has gone on during this pandemic that has sort of forced us to be in our own spaces, but I was very glad that those that I've asked agreed to meet and chat. So one thing I want to mention within this presentation and these interviews that I conducted, I interviewed gardeners that were ornamental gardeners. So it's basically another talk I could give about those that are farmers. And of course, we have a large population of Asian farmers here in the Puget Sound region that are thriving and doing some incredible work. But my focus today will be on ornamental gardening. And of course, I had to keep in mind and be sensitive to the different comfort levels of sharing. And again, going back to the myth of Asians being very timid and very quiet. Some were very open and you could just spend all day chatting with them. And then some are very reserved and agreed to not meet in person. So we have all different levels, and it's being mindful and being respectful of those levels of comfort. So the first person I want to introduce to you is my friend Scott. And Scott is from Taiwan, and he is an avid plant collector here in the Pacific Northwest. And I met him actually a few years ago at a plant sale. And if you've ever been to a plant sale, basically any plant sale, doesn't matter where you go, the demographic is pretty obvious when you step in. So it was interesting to see someone of color, someone that was of color and male, being very interested in plants. So I remember him from this, sea of gardeners, looking for really unusual and cool plants. And he was there with his wife, and I noticed his box and what he was carrying. And I looked and like, oh, this guy knows his stuff. Like he has some really cool things that he's, that he's buying. So I had a chance to meet him and I've gotten to know him over the years. And I'm glad I had a chance to visit him, to sit down and just learn a little bit more about Scott. So this photo was taken, gosh, maybe 2 years ago. We're with our friend Alex there, strolling the grounds of the Bellevue Botanical Garden in Bellevue, Washington. And Scott is an easygoing, kind of shy individual, but he knows his plants. He does his homework, and it's been fun seeing him grow as a gardener, broaden his plant palette, and also broaden his community of people. We oftentimes, when you see different people at different events more and more, there's likely chance that you'll meet and get to know them. But Scott is someone that I really admire because his taste in plants is incredible. He has all the cool stuff. He's inspired by plant explorers like Dan Hinckley, for example, seeking out the rare and unusual. But also Scott is someone that is traditional, and I mean that in a complimentary way, in that he, as a plant collector, he's very drawn to plants that are very significant in his culture. But at the same time, when you're a gardener here in the Pacific Northwest, you go to plant sales and you go to visit other gardens, you're inspired by different ideas that you want to try and bring home. So as much of a collector as he is, he also experiments and tries out different plants and see what he likes and what works. And in some ways, isn't that what we all do as gardeners? But with Scott, I remember asking him if there was one plant or a group of plants that you would grow, that you would always have with you wherever you lived, that you would always have with you, what would it be? So he came up with a few. Of course, it's a really difficult question to ask any plant person, but he came up with two plants that I want to share with you and talk about. So Michelia, which is now classified as magnolia. This is Magnolia figo, and it's known as the banana shrub. And it gets that name. It has really tiny flowers that are about 1 inch or 2 inches wide. It has this wonderful, delicious scent of banana, but it's not like eating the fruit banana. It's more like a banana candy like smell to it. It's quite strong, and in a way, you almost want to eat it. And I think you probably could actually, because I've seen magnolia flowers, being prepared and eaten. So to him, it's a plant that he grew up with in Taiwan. So I'm sure he probably has early childhood memories of it. And it's something that's so distinct, and it's a really beautiful plant when it's grown. It's not fully hardy for us here in the Pacific Northwest, although there are hybrids of magnolia, of Michelia, that that have been developed that are very similar to Magnolia figo, but are hardier. And so you can find something similar, but he has a close connection with it, and it's one of the plants that he wants to always be growing. And the same with this plant. So I think Scott might have the largest collection of osmanthus here in the Northwest, and he may deny it. But having been to his garden and going through his little kind of makeshift nursery of plants, he's got quite the variety. So osmanthus fragrans is known as the sweet olive, and it flowers for us here in autumn and has a wonderful, wonderful fragrance. And to me, it's very reminiscent of apricots. To me, that's what it smells like. But it's a broadleaf evergreen shrub that does very well for us here in the Pacific Northwest. And there's different forms of it too, some better than others in our region. And there are hybrids as well. But it's these flowers that sometimes you don't even see them, but when you're walking through the shrub, and it can also be a small tree, there's this scent in the air that just sort of lingers and wafts that is so delicious that you just have to kind of look around and figure out, oh my gosh, where is that coming from? So it's a beautiful plant. And again, probably a plant that he has a personal connection to. And in China, and I'm sure also in Taiwan, they'll dry the flowers, they use them in tea, they'll use them in cooking, and they have many different uses. But that scent is just so memorable and so iconic that it's one of Scott's favorites. So here he is in his garden, and you can see this diversity, this lushness of just plants everywhere. There's, not even soil showing, maybe except that one little spot where he might find something. But it's been fun to see his interest broaden from the key plants that he does like, to other things that he'll experiment with. And that's what really gardening is all about for us, is being able to experiment and to try and to fail and to learn from those failures. And I snapped this photo of Scott when he helped me out at a show garden that I created at the Northwest Flower and Garden Show a few years ago. And this was during setup, and they had the theatrical lighting on. But here he is, sort of nestled amongst one of his favorite plant families, actually, and one of my favorites as well, which is the Araliaceae, the Aralia family. So here he is behind a plant called Fatsia, Fatsia japonica. And right behind him is a plant called a Schefflera. And it's actually a species of Schefflera that is from Taiwan, where he's from. So he very kindly gave us a little tour, is giving us a little tour of his garden. And he talked about this group of plants. So I want Scott to take over so you can hear his voice and you can hear his story.
That I have seen that grow in Taiwan in the wild. So I was in Taiwan about 3 years ago, and I was visiting Shanlinxi. It's in the middle of the Taiwan, and it's I forgot how high that is, but it was on the mountain. So when I was in a big shrub or a tree that the leaf looks familiar, then I realized what that is. It's the Fascia polycarpa, and it was amazing to see how big its growth in the wild, and I can't wait my mine to be that size one day. So then on the way to that area that are near the roads, I saw the hydrangea aspera that's grow just on the near the side of the roads, and there were a few, and I assuming it's probably the same variety but looks identical. Anyway, it's interesting to see that just like a weed growing near the roads, and we are kind of treated as a precious tree or the plants here. And the next thing I saw was on a cliff. This is the fern that I saw on the cliff. It's the Woodwardia unigimata, and the leaf was huge. It's at least 4 or 5 feet, and maybe it's much bigger, but from the distance, so you can see it's really huge fern grow on the cliff, and I can still feel the goosebump when I noticed that. So anyway, here are the few plants, and this is another one from Taiwan, and Schefflera taiwaniana, and I may not pronounce that correctly, but anyway, hopefully I will see this in the wild one day, but I hasn't had a chance yet, but hopefully one day. Enjoy the gardening.
So it's pretty remarkable with Scott to be, in a way, reconnected to his roots through his garden and through the plants that he has that are actually native to his native Taiwan. And it's funny to hear too, like that hydrangea, for example, where it's basically a roadside weed there, but yet it's this highly sought after, really precious, rare plant that we have in our gardens here. So it was certainly fun to to hear his stories, and it takes me back to when I went to China actually, and went botanizing myself to see a lot of these species. Um, and similar species to these. But I'd love to go to visit Taiwan someday so I can see these in person as well. So it's pretty remarkable that he has that connection, and that's why he's able to garden. And it's having these stories to share that makes it really impressive. So yeah, there's Scott for you. Really cool guy that I hope you'll have a chance to meet if you are here in the Pacific Northwest. The second person I'd like to introduce to you is Sari. And Sari is someone that I really enjoyed meeting. This was a few years ago during one of the holiday parties for the NARGS group, which is NARGS is the North American Rock Garden Society. And again, very similar demographic of their membership. And then all of a sudden, I noticed this uh, short Asian woman that was like, oh, like again, she stood out. And in just sitting with her and learning more about her, I just lit up because she is so enthusiastic and so knowledgeable. And it's been a wonderful opportunity getting to know her. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to meet with her in person, but she did send me some photographs of some of her work. And if you're not familiar with this flower, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. So these are called hepatica, and they are small, short woodland flowers native to Japan. And there's actually a few species in China. There's also a few species here in North America that exist. So these small woodland plants that if you're ever out hiking, you've probably stepped on one. But in Japan, they are highly, highly sought after, especially these really unique color forms, and those that are multi-petaled. They're highly revered, very expensive, and treasured by plantsmen all around the world who collect them and pay lots and lots of money for them. It's a little ridiculous, but Sari was inspired by this group of plants through another plantsman, and started growing and collecting, and now is breeding them. And this is just an example of this particular genus and what they look like. So they're very diminutive, very small, but they're very charming and super cute. So they're actually blooming at this time of year, and how I wish this pandemic was not existing, because I would love to see this in person. Because look at this color range of these incredible flowers. They're just short and really sweet and really, really, really charming. And as you can see, very meticulous in how they're looked after and how they're cared for. Usually you'll see hepaticas grown in very ornate containers, but this is her breeding program. So each individual plant, it's in its own pot, and they flower, and she will evaluate the flowers, and depending on what sort of characteristics she's breeding for. But it's this wonderful array of color early in the spring. How I wish to be able to see this in person. But aside from hepaticas, Saori is also a very, very good grower who is so talented at growing from seed. And when you grow certain plants from seed, you have to be very patient, much like a tree, for example, that can take years and years until it reaches its full potential. And a lot of these plants here, what we're looking at are trilliums. Trilliums from seed can take anywhere from 5 to 12 years from flowering from seed. And Saori does an incredible job. So the North American Rock Garden Society has an incredible seed exchange, or a seed list where you can buy seeds from members' donations. So she is probably one of the first people to get on that list and place her order. And she does an incredible job of growing them. I mean, look at these trilliums. They're just, to any plant people, these are just the most sought after highly coveted plants, and so expensive because they are so painstakingly slow to grow and propagate, especially from seed. But Sari has the patience and the attention to detail to be successful, and it is absolutely stunning. So her plant interests go beyond the Trillium and Hepatica. It goes into rhododendrons. It goes into native plants like these delphiniums, Lewisias, even that, look at this, a black clematis. Most people know clematis as a vine. And it just goes on and on. Fritillarias here, more trilliums, cyclamen. This is erythronium here, also known as a dogtooth violet, Lewisia. So it's incredible. And she's not done. Here's a few more things that she works on. She also loves roses. And with roses, she's dabbled into breeding them as well. So as you could probably imagine, she has a pretty incredible garden. And I did get a chance to visit a few years ago, and she sent me home with this. It was one of the most generous gifts any plant person, any florist could ever could ever have, is to visit someone's personal garden and to be able to be allowed to cut and to harvest and to share their stories and their enthusiasm. It was a wonderful, wonderful summer day, and I really am looking forward to reconnecting with Sari. So she's awesome. All right, moving on. So one of my favorite gardens here in the Pacific Northwest is the rhododendron species botanical garden in Federal Way. So this garden is, as the name implies, an incredible treasure trove of species rhododendrons. But it's not just the rhodies, though, in this garden. It's all the companion plants and the plants that grow with rhododendrons in the wild that they also have represented in this garden. So it's a botanically rich, beautiful garden that right now in spring is spectacular. I need to get down there sometime soon. But I want to introduce you to a young woman that makes this garden possible in terms of its plant accessions, its nursery stock, and all the incredible plants that make this garden what it is. And that's Atsuko Gibson. Atsuko is someone I've just started to get to know, and originally from Japan. She actually went to school here in the United States in the University of Arkansas, where she got her horticulture degree, and she spent some time in Scotland actually as an intern at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. So she has cred. This is someone that obviously knows her stuff, and remarkable in terms of her climb, in terms of her career, starting out as a gardener and then working her way up to her position now as the assistant curator and nursery manager at the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden. So it's always a fun time visiting with Atsuko. I'm always learning something from her every time we chat. And of course, we had to keep our distance, but she kindly let me interview her for this presentation and walk through the garden last summer. So with Atsuko, her specialty is species rhododendrons, and the collection there is incredible. Most people think of rhododendrons as sort of, here in the Northwest at least, this sort of boring, gaudy kind of plant that grandma probably planted, and they're just boring. But the species, the rhododendrons that Mother Nature created, are one of the most diverse and most fabulous of all plants, really. So plants with big leaves and giant flowers, pink flowers, red, even near blue. The color range is fantastic. Some are fragrant, and not just the flowers, but the foliage on some of these rhododendron species is incredible and so fascinating. So with Atsuko, a few years ago, they hosted a rhododendron species symposium, and it brought a lot of experts from around the world to come to Seattle, to Federal Way, to study at the gardens, at the rhododendron species garden. And I want you all to learn a little bit more about rhodies and hear Atsuko's voice.
For bigger flower, better color, things like that. This is the one we looked at the garden, cerulean mist. You can tell it's the darkest form of all, right? And then this one, what we named as best purple, and it's a double quote because it's not really an official name because we never registered it. So that's what we call it. But if you look up online, it probably won't come up.
What I loved about this clip is, she's talking about, first of all, one of my favorite rhododendron species. I love Rhododendron augustinii. It's really stunning, and I do have cerulean mist. But the position that she is in now, the authority that she has, first of all, someone that's a woman that's in a position of leadership is often really rare. A woman in a position of leadership within horticulture is even more rare. So to see her sort of, take command, she knows her stuff, and to, be presenting this breadth of knowledge to a bunch of, older white men, to me was impressive, and that, she owned it. And it's something that I hope she recognizes, just how much of an influence that she is, and a role model that she can be to those that are younger, that are Japanese, Asian, that can look up to Atsuko to see that, oh, I can work with plants and grow flowers and be recognized and be important and to be a leader. So Atsuko is a really incredible young woman. And I mentioned earlier, I'm always learning about rhododendrons. I didn't realize that some are actually grown as houseplants. So this group of rhododendrons are known as Spirea. And so they're tropical species, so they're not hardy. We can't grow them outside here. But Atsuko tells me that, hey, if you've ever grown orchids and can grow an orchid, you can probably grow these Spirea rhododendrons. Because like orchids, a lot of orchids, these Spireas tend to be epiphytic, meaning they're like air plants. They attach themselves to rocks or to stumps or branches, so they don't really require that much actual soil in which to survive. So it lends itself very well to being grown in containers or in baskets. And it's a really fascinating group of rhododendrons. As you can see, the leaf shape, or the flower shape, I should say, it's very distinct and very unique, of course, aimed towards its natural pollinators in the wild, but also the color range that they come into, far more vibrant and really unique. So these are actually being grown within the conservatory that's at the Rhododendron Species Garden, and the diversity of these species is really astounding. Just a few more examples there of what was in bloom at the time. So I had asked Atsuko if she had a message for someone young and up and coming and interested in horticulture, what would be the advice you would give them? Here's what she had to say.
So my advice to anybody from Japan who wants to get started in horticulture is to be specialized within horticulture. I specialize in species rhododendrons, so it can be any plant genera that you specialize, or it can be any type of gardening. It can be Japanese gardening, something like that. So that's what I would recommend.
So Atsuko brings up a really good point, actually, when it comes to specializing in this field, because horticulture is a very, very broad field with many different facets to it. And much like me, and I'm very guilty of it, I tend to dabble in all these different areas of specialization. I want to be an expert in, rhododendrons, in lilies, in orchids, and roses, and all these sorts of things. But to actually be competitive in the workforce, if you have an area of specialization or specific skill, whether it's plant propagation or curation in public gardens and that sort of thing, there's a place for everyone within horticulture. So I'm glad she mentioned that and gave that piece of advice to someone entering horticulture. All right. Next group, so it is a group of two wonderful ladies that I've had the most wonderful time getting to know because they're also Filipino. So I would like to introduce you all to Ate Leti and Ate Aurora. And I say ate. Ate means big sister in Tagalog. So I'm sure they smile and appreciate being called big sister versus, you know, auntie or um, someone older. But to me, they're like big sisters, although they could probably be, you know, my mom or my aunt. But meeting someone from my homeland who is as avid as a gardener as I am has been such a privilege. And also, it was so much fun getting a chance to meet them. Of course, even during this pandemic, we were able to meet, again, social distance with our masks on. Having an opportunity to get to know them better was really enlightening and really inspiring for me to hear their story, because our stories as immigrants are very different. And from them, you know, they immigrated to the US many years ago, and neither of them are in the industry. They're both hobbyists, but they're very good at what they do. So they told me about growing up in the Philippines, and they actually had an early exposure to working with plants and gardening because their father was in forestry. So they gained an appreciation for plants and gardens and landscapes early on, and has always been a hobby. So when they moved to the United States, they, you know, like many families, you do what you need to do. You get a job that will pay the bills and allow you to save money. So they entered fields in, you know, in medicine, became a nurse, and more in hospitality, accounting, all these different fields. But gardening and working with plants has always been their passion. So visiting them was an actual treat because you can see, and because I can relate, and to see their pots of wonderful, beautiful plants from, you know, from all over, you can just tell that they enjoy taking care of plants, from really common things to really unusual things. To me, what's so significant about knowing Ate Leti and Ate Aurora was, for me, almost validating to know them, that someone from my background, from my heritage, from my homeland, understands me and what I do as a horticulturist. And they understand my enthusiasm. They understand the work that I put in to get to where I am, and to recognize it. And because of that, most people will think of horticulture and gardening as a purely a hobby. And it's also a luxury for most people. Not everyone has a garden. Not everyone has land or property or even a house in which to garden. But and also within the Filipino culture, how I grew up, I remember my parents always asking why I was growing these plants that they couldn't use, they couldn't eat. So I always had the hardest time sort of explaining myself and almost defending myself about why I chose this career. But with Ate Leti and Ate Aurora, they almost, you know, praise me for the work, you know, that I do. And it just means a lot to me to get to know them. Now, I took this picture to give you a little bit of insight on Filipino culture and how we approach gardening and growing plants. So I want you to pay attention to these three plants that are represented here. So at the top here is a fig, and just below it to the left is the banana, a banana plant, and right below is an oleander. So each of these plants has, to me, symbolic and significant meaning in how we approach gardening. So the fig, I don't think we even have figs in the Philippines, come to think of it. But a fig tree has these very large leaves that are almost very reminiscent of a fruit in the Philippines that I grew up with. But of course, it does produce the fruit, so it's something you can grow and it'll produce fruit and you can eat it. So that, you know, they would understand growing. They would also understand growing, but will probably be shocked to know that grows here, is the banana. So there are a handful of banana species that are actually hardy, meaning they'll grow in cold climates. And here in the Pacific Northwest, the most common is Musa basju. Musa is the botanical name for a banana, and basju is a species. And this plant is known as the Japanese fiber banana, and we can actually grow this in the ground, and it will produce leaves, it'll even flower, and it'll even produce fruit. Unfortunately, the fruit isn't edible, but just having the leaves, just having the fact that you have a banana that grows in Seattle is much like people react to palms. Like, oh wow, like why are there palm trees here in Seattle? I thought they only, grew in Hawaii or a tropical country. But there's always exceptions. So the banana is such an iconic plant that we use for everything. Of course, the fruits we eat at home, we even eat the flower bud, and the leaves we would use as plates or to wrap food in. And once a banana has finished fruiting, pretty much that section of the plant dies, and we cut it off, and actually makes a really fun raft that we would basically take to like the lake. And because if you ever cut through a banana leaf or stem, it has it's basically like half of its air basically, so it has these different channels. So it floats in water. So it makes a really fun, lifesaver, basically, or a big, long, like, what do they call them? Noodles or something like that. So the banana, iconic, Philippine plant. And then the last plant I want to talk about is this plant with the pink flowers. This is Nerium oleander, and I think it grows in the Philippines. But this plant, the story behind it that Ate Aurora told me is the story of another sort of common stereotype or misconception almost of Asians, is how thrifty we are, or dare I say cheap sometimes, where if something was on discount or something was a good deal, like we would always gravitate towards those things. And the story behind this oleander plant is, according to Ate Aurora, was she was in California and she saw this plant and thought it was beautiful. And she may or may not have asked for permission to take a few clippings and a few branches and put it in her suitcase, flew back to Seattle, and got them to root. So this was a plant that she successfully was able to root and now has as part of her garden. So it just sort of reminds me of a lot of our behaviors, I guess you could say, and the ways we accumulate plants and what sort of plants were important to us. It had to be useful, it had to be something you can eat, or has to have some sort of compelling story behind it. So while taking the time to catch up with them and to see their garden, I recognized a flower that I used to grow actually, and was really delighted to see that they were growing it as well. So I decided to record this moment, which to me just really puts a smile on my face.
Oh my gosh, this is so funny that you had this.
Just put it in the water.
Yeah,
That came from you.
I know.
That's something. So you sold the one to me for $15.
You even remembered how much it cost.
That's a cutting.
All right. Well, I think I'll
Yeah.
I'll get a cutting and
Oh, okay. Take several.
oh, I'm sure
You have
one
your
will be
pruner?
fine. In the car, I'll grab one. Thank you so
There's
much.
two now. There's two of them. Eh? One and two. One time they had some kind of white fly.
Yeah, they're such
Yeah.
pest magnets, unfortunately. But
I've been hosing them down.
and I think that's the best way to keep the bugs away, to
Mhm.
just hose them down. So, I wonder kung may amoy na.
Just ask if it has a
Ay,
stand.
mabango.
No, not yet. Mamaya.
That's waiting for it.
Oh. Oh, thank you, Ate Leti.
You're welcome.
So just hearing them laugh uh, reminds me so much of, my mom, my aunt, my family. And like I said earlier, to me, it means so much to get to know them, to share in this enthusiasm, to make me feel like I've pursued my interests and my passions, and that they approve. So it was really fun to to reconnect with them and see this plant. And so this plant, if you didn't hear, it's known as the angel's trumpet or Bergmansia, and it's a selection called shredded white. It's kind of a silly, dumb name, but it's very unusual. And a few years ago, when I was in high school, college, actually, yeah, when I first met them, I was selling plants. I had a small little specialty nursery, and I was selling plants at local plant sales. And this was one of them. And she reminded me, at the Aurora reminded me that, yeah, she bought this plant from me for $15. And to this day, they still kept it going. So they kindly offered me some cuttings, which I got to root. So I have it growing again. So that was fun. So before I left, I was also reminded of just what it means to be Filipino and a lot of the things that we've become known for uh, as a country and as a community, and that's our generosity and our hospitality. So of course they weren't going to let me leave, empty-handed, and so they gave this incredible offering of the most luscious tomatoes that, of course, they grew. There's some kale in there, some basil, just all sorts of fun summer stuff, some peppers. So what a wonderful treat. Visit with them, and I'm very grateful to know both Ati Leti and Ati Aurora. All right, and the last person I want to introduce you to is my friend Chitra. And Chitra is from India, and I met her again many years ago, and we were actually judges for this amateur gardening competition. And again, when I first met her, sort of she absolutely stood out, and actually, yeah, reminded me of someone that I knew. Like she could have been, an aunt or grandma. And over the years, I've had a chance to see her and get to know her. And she was kind enough to let me come by to see her home and her garden. And we had a wonderful, wonderful chat. And she has this incredible home in Kirkland, right there on the water, and a wonderful garden that just showcases her interests and her passions. So Chitra mentioned to me that she is at this age where she's getting older and starting to change the way she gardens. She used to have a lot more different types of flowers and annuals and lots of colors, but now she says she's transitioning more into evergreen, more woody types of plants that aren't as fussy, I guess. But she still has color. She has a wonderful garden that is this culmination of going to different plant sales, her experience as a student when she took some classes at Edmonds College and their wonderful Hort program. She is someone that is always learning and is so eager to learn and finds any little tidbit of information so fascinating with her enthusiasm. So she's also an avid plant collector, like we all, all gardeners are, and always seeking out the rare and the unusual and the different. But sometimes even the most common, she finds such great joy in. So I would like for you to hear her and this little clip that I was sneaky in recording, because her enthusiasm is so infectious. Have a listen.
Season, you know. So see, look how it spreads. It's a woodland beauty.
Say the name one more time.
Pollia.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Oh, Walt. We
These are
love Walt.
avocados coming up because I compost. And last week I found out.
She's so Asian. Oh my god.
I found out that you can eat them. No, last year when we were in Oaxaca, we had an appetizer that was made with avocado leaf.
Oh, really?
It
Huh.
was divine. So I said, let me look it up.
G-Fest avocados. Oh.
Then you know what I do? Instead of putting it in the yard waste,
Yeah.
I bring my compost and dig it around my plants. And this year, my Ito, poppy, a peony,
Oh, huh?
11 blossoms on one plant.
Yay!
Fantastic! Oh my God, flowers were this big.
Yeah.
Yellow, it was called Bartzella.
Patella, of course.
Yes.
Yes, the classic. Yeah, the classic Ito. Yes.
Yes, is it? Yeah, I didn't know that when we went to the garden club 2-3 years ago. We bought it and then there you hold it. You have it there.
She's such a kick because so you probably heard there are these avocado seedlings that she had. So she composts, and we throw the avocado peels in the pits in the compost, and sometimes they just grow. And it reminds me so much of what my mom actually used to do, where we would have like mangoes or avocados, and she would always save the seeds, thinking that we were going to grow them, we were going to get these large trees. And I keep telling her, like, they don't grow here. But it's that experience, it's that process of growing, seeing something grow and nurturing it is something that obviously exists within our cultures. So Chicha's great, and I love chatting with her, and she's also an amazing cook. So it's always a treat to visit with Chitra, and I'm glad she made time to visit. So this is just a handful of individuals, and there's many more out there that I'd like to introduce you to, and that I would like to sit down and interview to expand on this presentation and to be able to present it again. But really quickly, I want to show you a few individuals that I didn't get a chance to visit, but I think are making waves, and I'm hoping that you'll hear more about them in the near future. This is my friend Yoko Arakawa, and again, Yoko is someone that I really admire, and in the public gardening realm, she is like this legend. She hails from Longwood Gardens, where she worked, where she trained as a professional gardener, and became part of their staff, and spearheaded this incredible project that's known as the Thousand Bloom Chrysanthemum. So it's this annual display they have each year in the fall, where they have these mums, these chrysanthemums that have been grown, meticulously cared for and pruned to all flower at the same time. Basically, one plant producing up to 1,000 flowers. And it's absolutely incredible. So it's her techniques that she used and has been passing down to gardeners to learn this really, really challenging skill that only very few people know. And now she's here living in the Pacific Northwest and hoping for an opportunity to really showcase her talent. So I've been very lucky to get to know her. And Tony is a colleague of mine, also from the Philippines. He actually has his own landscape company that he does work for around the Puget Sound region. But his love and passion lies in the beautiful art of bonsai that he does really, really well. And I had a chance to visit him at his garden and see his work, and it's incredible what he can do, and the character that each piece has and the story that it has is quite remarkable. So Tony's great, and I really want to have a chance to sit down with him and learn more about his path towards his career. And this gentleman, Mike Fong, probably has the coolest job right now in terms of Northwest horticulture, because he gets to work with the coolest plants in a pretty cool venue. And if you're not familiar with this venue, these are sometimes referred to as Bezos balls, better known as the Amazon spheres in downtown Seattle. So inside is this incredible, incredible collection of tropicals from all around the world, assembled together in this really unique space, climate controlled, all the bells and whistles into this modern day botanical garden encased in glass, and it's just beautiful. The vertical green walls are stunning, and of course closed due to the pandemic, but still being cared for. But a wonderful venture that hopefully the public will have some access to in the future, so they can see just how incredible the work that they're doing. So with these individuals that I've had a chance to meet and spend time with and reconnect, and I was very curious, and I wanted to ask these burning questions that I've asked myself. I myself asked these questions, but I wanted their take, and I wanted to hear from them what it means to be an Asian gardener here in the Pacific Northwest. So I asked questions like, do you see the value in joining a garden club or any organization that's focused on your interest? Do you feel welcome in plant sales? Events like meetings and lectures, even going to a nursery or even a garden or a park. How do you feel welcome? Do you feel language is a barrier, and are you afraid that you won't be understood? And lastly, I asked, do you think it will make a difference in how people see gardens if there were more Asian or people of color present? And here were their responses. Do you see the value in joining an organization? One of them said, yes, online groups are more comfortable for me. It's good to know people in the same region I garden and that understand the climate and understand the culture in a way. And there's always people that are willing to help. And but there's always that hesitation of feeling like they might not know enough. And another response was, yes, they see the value in it. And although even most of the members are older, they were nice. And it's been fun meeting a lot of nice people. So a lot of these groups, as serious as they may sound, a horticultural, society, they're holding, conferences and, symposiums, that sort of thing. A lot of these groups are essentially garden clubs. They're very social, but they can also be quite serious, depending on how involved you want to be. Another response was definitely yes. Even though this is a person that doesn't like being in groups, they feel that joining a garden club can be very helpful and also very fun. And another response basically was having an opportunity to meet new people, to speak in English and to practice their English. But even with a language barrier, there's always mutual connection that we all have with plants that sometimes you don't even need to say anything. You just feel it. So that's what they certainly felt. And then, of course, asking, do you feel welcome in plant sales or being in public gardens? And one response was, when the first time they went to a plant sale, they felt, or a meeting, a lecture of some kind, they felt intimidated because they thought it was a very serious group. At first experience, no one really talked to them, unfortunately. Then they realized that it wasn't that the people were unfriendly, that they were just involved with the conversations with the people that they knew. And it's very common to, obviously, in any sort of group setting, you gravitate towards something that's familiar, right? And that's simply what they did. And in the occasion where there is an opportunity for introductions and or different means of starting up a conversation, then you can relax a little bit and actually get to know these individuals. And another response was, I certainly never felt unwelcome because of their gender or their ethnicity or any of that sort. So that's good to hear. Then I asked about language and asking if they were afraid about being misunderstood, that they had a strong accent and that sort of thing. And one response was sometimes, especially if they encounter technical words that they're not familiar with, and also worrying about people were being, if they were being understood. And it's sort of this personal sort of confidence that that needs to come out, but doesn't always. So there's always a hesitation. And then I asked, do you think it will make a difference in how people see and experience gardens if there were more Asian or people of color present? And one response was not really making it, any sort of difference. And I think here in the Pacific Northwest, it's a very diverse community of people that we often really don't think about it unless you really look at it, closely and really analyze. But for the most part, we're so used to seeing different people from different backgrounds. And so they felt that wouldn't make that much of a difference. Another response was, well, not really, but being that gardening is what it is, we all share the same love for these plants, and the interest usually wins. And also with these types of groups and events, if there is a personal interest in a particular group, or if they're having a lecture in a particular topic that's being presented, or if there is a plant sale involved, then people will just go, and they don't really think about it. Another thought was maybe it would be nice for newer individuals, especially those new to gardening, to see more diversity so they won't feel intimidated, and they can see someone that is similar to them, like them, that is also engaged, and so they can feel like, oh, I can do this too, And the last response was, yes, it should be more inclusive, but many are more practical and sometimes have to work multiple jobs. So this is a key thing, I think, that we all have to recognize, that gardening is really a hobby and a luxury for a lot of people, but it doesn't mean that it's not accessible to everyone. Everyone can garden at different levels, at their own time, at their own pace, at their own comfort level. But in reality, much like my parents growing up, who had to work multiple jobs to be able to pay the bills and that sort of thing, it makes it hard to make time to socialize, to volunteer, at a plant sale, to take part in lectures and garden tours and that sort of thing. So if you really want to be involved, you can. And I think everyone should have that opportunity to be involved as much as they would like. So I want to finish up this talk and this conversation by wrapping up a lot of the things that we've talked about, from the history of Asian Americans, the very brief history that I presented to you, and the progression of the different examples of the landscapes that we have here in Seattle that represent an Asian culture and an Asian influence. And here is just an image, again, at the Seattle Chinese Garden, with the pavilion there, Zhongmei, and the Seattle skyline there, just behind the trees. This is during the Peony Festival, which every year I think gets better and better as the plants get established and produce more flowers. It's this wonderful gathering of the community where they can celebrate their culture, they can dress up, they can take pictures, they can bring the kids. And to me, what better place than a garden to be able to come together and share in the joy of plants and flowers, and to learn about one another, to learn about each other's cultures and each other's backgrounds. And if you look closely at this picture, look at the little ones here. What better place than a garden to teach these children about the different plants, the different flowers, and also the different people that are around them as well. It's such a beautiful, beautiful place and a wonderful platform for them to be able to learn. And also, too, I cringe at this and you might laugh, but this is also the best opportunity to remind little ones to please, please be careful, to not step on the plants and to stay on the paths. These are all rules that we all should follow and we all should learn together, especially as little kids. You know, monkey see, monkey do sometimes, right? This is our opportunity to share within the next generation what is valuable and what is important in our communities and who these individuals are in the communities and why we come together and how we can come together, and what better place than the garden. And again, this festival really brings out the best in this community, young and old, whether you're in a wheelchair, in a walker, you know, we have access. And here in the Seattle region, we have wonderful parks and green spaces where we can be and where we can enjoy. And it is open and available to everyone. And once we can gather again for events and celebrations where we can be together as a community, we can take part in events like this. This is actually a photo that Ate Aurora took. She's a fantastic photographer. And this was an event at the Japanese garden. And what better venue to celebrate and for different cultures to come together and learn and to inspire one another is something I'm looking forward to once we overcome this pandemic. And for me personally, being in a space where I can feel at home and I can also be with my friends and my own family in a garden setting, to me, that's very special. And here we're in KUBOTA, and the people in this slide here are my family. There's my brother there. I don't know what he's doing in the bushes there. My sister, just see their heads in the back. My cousin, her husband, my other cousin, his wife. And for me, it's always been a struggle to share what I do with my family, because there are times where I feel like they don't understand and they don't get. And I'm constantly finding ways to sort of bridge the two worlds together. And I'm able to do so, you know, when I make a bouquet to give to someone for their birthday, or if I'm harvesting something, you know, from the farm, or they have extra produce from the CSA, and I share it with them. You know, those things they understand. But to be in a space and in a garden like this, you know, they don't need to be bombarded by the different plant names and, you know, how they are grown. I mean, they can certainly be curious, but to just having them be in this space for them to enjoy and to relax and to be together as a family really means a lot. So with that, I'm going to finish this talk with a quote that actually Chitra sent me. After our interview, she actually called and I wasn't able to pick up, so she left me with a voicemail with this quote. As an Asian gardener, or any person motivated by their passion, I feel that there is what people would call a glass ceiling. But with Asian communities, all we really want is a green ceiling, a canopy of plants and greenery, which is a ceiling that is limitless and allows everyone to go wherever their passion will take them. And I can't think of a more beautiful way to sort of sum up what it means to be an Asian gardener here in the Pacific Northwest. So with that, thank you for joining me, and thank you for taking the time to listen and to learn about the Asian gardening community here in the Northwest. Again, I've just begun to scratch the surface. There are many more people that I want to interview, many more people that I want to meet to learn their stories, and I'm exceedingly grateful to have this platform to share all this with you all and with the broader horticultural community. So thank you for joining me.